All right, welcome everybody. We're excited to have this conversation today. We're going to give folks just a couple more minutes to join. Welcome all. I'm seeing the room fill up. While folks are gathering, as is my habit, I'd love to know where people are calling in from. So if you would just say hi in the chat and let us know where in the world you are today. I think last week we had Denmark was maybe the farthest away. So Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Nashville, Saratoga. All right, South Africa's got the award right now. So Woodlands, Texas, we're feeling for you over there. Hope everything's well. Middle of nowhere, Texas. Hi, Monica. It's funny. Salem. I was just down in Salem last week for a family reunion. My wife's 120th family reunion in Oregon. So and it says, Eric, I'm echoing. I'm not sure if anyone else is getting that.
It looks like it's been solved. I think, at least for me, you sound good.
No echo. Okay, good. Might have to turn the headphones down a little bit. Okay, glad to see everybody. Nigeria, Carol, hello. Glad to have you here. Montreal, Canada. Julianne's in Montreal.
Yes, I am. It's a nice day today.
Good for you. All right. Well, I think we've got a quorum, so why don't we go ahead and kick off? And I know some other folks will be joining us, but we may as well get running here. So welcome. So glad to have you here for the second episode in our series on standing up a transformation office. For those of you that have not met me before, I'm Eric Wood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Tigerhall. I authored the book, The Strategy Activation Playbook, which was based on about 25 years of work between creating strategy at Bain and Company, standing up strategy as an executive in tech companies, most notably Intuit, and then subsequently about a 20-year career leading Explain, where we worked with Fortune 500 companies and global organizations to create change activation programs and bring them to life in organizations. So a lot of what we're talking about today is grounded in that experience, coupled with lots of current research and conversations with folks, including a number of folks here on the phone today. The Transformation Office series, if you weren't with us last week, this is a 5 webinar series. We're really exploring what does the Transformation Office, what is the role in the modern organization, and how do we future-proof our transformation capabilities? Last week, we talked about why transformation capacity is a competitive advantage. Today, we're going to transition to looking at some of the various models for transformation. For those of you that missed last week, let me just do the quick in our last episode update. So some of the key takeaways from last week, I argued that transformation capacity is the durable competitive advantage of the future. The basis for that, my point of view, is rooted on the fact that change is accelerating and the cost of poor execution is rising. We know that for the last 50 years, the pace of change has been dominated by Moore's Law. We see technology and compute power doubling at about every 2 years, and it's a fairly linear process from 1970 up to the current age. Then what we saw about 10 years ago was that linear process started to become exponential. That's been driven by AI. And what we're learning is that with AI, the compute is actually doubling every 6 months and accelerating. So what we're starting to see is a shift from a linear pace of change to an exponential pace of change. And so made the point that I believe a culture of capability and transformation is the competitive advantage of the next stage. As we move forward faster, we need to be able to build an enterprise transformation capability to allow us to scale change quickly through the organization in a standardized way, while coupling that with a culture of transformation agility so the people in our organization are equally resilient and collectively we have the change capacity to outrun our competitors and continue to evolve and grow and innovate as quickly as possible. So for those that missed last week, encourage you to go back and check it out. There's a lot of interesting data there to help you build a business case for why we need to make these changes. But in terms of just anchoring today's conversation, let's talk about the definition of change capacity for a second. If change capacity is what we need to build, change capacity measures the volume or bandwidth that your organization has to absorb and execute change. So I'm arguing that that is our outer limit of how fast our organizations can grow, change, evolve, and compete. So we want to build that change capacity up. And to do that, we need two things. Change capacity is going to be a function of our change capabilities. These are the institutionalized systems, processes, tools, toolkits that we follow to create change in our organization, combined with change agility. And this you can think of as our culture in our organization. Fundamentally, we need to build a culture of change to pair with that capability, and together they equal capacity. So in this series, we're going to be talking about both of those components. Today, I really want to focus on the first part, that capability. So if we can think of the transformation office as a container to keep the idea of the collective systems, processes, frameworks, tools, ways of change, that's really where we want to focus today. We want to first start by differentiating between different models. So we're going to talk about centralized, distributed, and hybrid transformation models. We want to explore how organizational factors such as your size, your maturity, where you fit in your industry might influence your selection of which type of transformation office model you might employ. And then we want to be able to start to think about how do we assess your own organization's needs and either select or evolve your current capabilities towards the future that we know is coming. So that's going to be our focus today. To situate us, let's start off with a quick poll. I'd love to understand where people are at today in terms of your current transformation capability. And then that'll give us a sense of kind of who's in the room. And hopefully each of you will find yourself in some of the conversation that we're going to have from here on out. But Julie's put the poll up. Please go ahead and select which of these four answers most fits your organization. And then we'll take a look at what we get.
I'm gonna give people a few more seconds to respond, and then I will show you guys the answers.
Can't wait. Interesting. I'm getting the sneak peek here.
Alrighty, I think I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys the results.
All right. So with about 80% of folks reporting in, we've got about a little over 40% of folks in the audience that say we don't have a formal transformation office. We manage change through a combination of project management strategy and functional teams as needed, but it's more of an ad hoc model and more of an informal model. So that's great because for each of you, we can talk quite a bit about how you might want to evolve that and some of the considerations for doing that work as we evolve towards sort of being ready for enterprise-wide change. For the other three models, we had roughly an even split. So 17% say we've got a centralized office, 19% say we actually have a highly distributed model, and then for 23% of you, you're in a hybrid model. So that's glad to see that, glad to share. And I know for each of you, I think you can probably take something away from today's conversation in terms of how your model might need to evolve in the future. I want to definitely talk quite a bit about future proofing. To ground us in what we see in the largest organizations of the world, the data set isn't very well researched. We weren't able to actually go out and understand all 500 of the Fortune 500, but by way of looking at sampling of over 100 of the Fortune 500, we can get a sense of roughly how the largest organizations are handling change today. And we see something like this. We see that about 30% of organizations have a centralized model. So largely command and control from the center, driving out across the organization. We see about 20% with that distributed model, where there's maybe not a strong center and a lot is delegated to the fringes of the organization. And then about half of the Fortune 500 have adopted some version of something in between. So jives pretty much with what we're saying here. But what we want to start to do now is talk about why we need to have a transformation office. And so for those of you that say, yeah, it's mostly ad hoc, 42% of you said, yeah, we're not really there in terms of a formalized structure yet. I'm going to start to build the case for why we want to start thinking about a formalized structure. And for the other folks, we want to start talking about whether your structure is the right structure for where we're headed. So, foundational statement here, we believe, like our podcast says, change is the only constant. In an area of the continuous disruption that we're seeing now with this faster exponential change curve, enterprise transformation is no longer a one-off initiative, right? We're not doing one enterprise change a year. According to Gartner research that we shared last week, most organizations are running 15 to 20 different enterprise changes annually, and that pace is only increasing. So we now know that change is always on, and it's a permanent condition of doing business. As a result, we're seeing more and more of the largest companies establishing formal transformation offices to manage that complexity of change and accelerate their execution. And the key question we want to struggle with today, or maybe not struggle with, but at least take on, is how should your TO be structured to deliver that maximum impact? How do we evaluate what's needed to meet the current and future needs of our organization? So I'm going to first ground us before we embrace that with kind of a definition of a transformation office. As I said earlier, I'd like us to think of the transformation office as a container. This is the container that has our ways of working around transformation. Its mission is to align, orchestrate, and accelerate enterprise-wide change. So we know in large organizations that there's an alignment function that has to happen. We need to make sure that every initiative, team, and resource is connected to the organization's strategic priorities in some meaningful way, and that we have a shared way of understanding what's important and what's not. So alignment is one key function that I want to see the transformation office succeed with. The second one is orchestration. So if you've got an ad hoc model, you probably have silos of folks doing change communications over here, maybe learning development over there, maybe a project management office over here that's organizing some of the work. Maybe that's distributed in broad ways across different business units. To be effective at enterprise-wide change, we need to orchestrate that work, and we need to build that connective tissue between those functions, between those business units, so that we can drive cohesive execution. And then lastly, the transformation office has a mission to accelerate change. So it not only needs to remove obstacles and streamline decision making so that we can course correct our changes to keep them on track, but we also have to provide those focused tools, frameworks, support, training, development, so that we can grow our culture, grow our leadership, grow our employees to be agile and resilient in the face of change and actually support rapid and accelerated transformation. So with that definition in mind, I'm going to next debunk a myth. There is no one right way to do this. And I know that folks that are sitting in the room, as I sort of advocate for one or another model, will say, well, this is the best way to do it. That's the best way to do it. In my experience, this is the third best way to do it. The reality, of course, is that it depends on your organization, your context, how you're structured, and the outside forces acting on your organization. So what we want to talk about today is a spectrum of models so that you can understand where you fit and what might best serve you. What worked for centralized, more monolithic enterprises might fail spectacularly in a fast-moving, federated global business. So one model that works in one place is not going to work in the other. The other thing that I want to be thinking about is that as the pace of change increases, we also need to be thinking about how our model changes. So how does our transformation office not stay rigid in the way we're working today, but evolve over time to meet the new challenges we're facing? So the reality that we're going to be talking about is that there's many paths. There's multiple ways to structure your transformation office to support your unique enterprise and circumstances. You're going to intentionally tailor your model to your unique context so that you can balance that strategic alignment that you need in the organization to make enterprise-wide change with the execution flexibility that you need on the ground at the periphery to be fast, effective, and agile. We also know that we want to build into that ability for that model to change. So you should be anticipating that what you're building today is not going to be what you're operating tomorrow. And we should build that agility right into our transformation office's model itself. And I see some raised hands. What we're going to end up doing is doing some Q&A at the end. But if you do have a quick question, please drop it in the chat, and Julie can help answer that and or collect the question for the end of the session. So this puts us at a crossroads of a design decision. We need to start thinking about what model is going to be right for you. So this is going to be sort of focused on three lenses. What I do is advocate for you to sit with your team and start thinking through these three lenses as you evaluate your model and think about what you need to have in the future. First, we want to look at the frameworks that are available. So for inspiration, let's look at centralized models versus distributed models and hybrid models to understand what's out there. Secondly, let's look at their features. So what are the strengths, risks, and trade-offs of each model? And how do those apply to your context? And then with that in mind, you can then assess fit. What is going to best fit our organization, given where we're at and where we're headed? What's the model that's going to work right for us? So it'll probably be a different answer for every one of you. So to anchor my point of view that we're going to start to unpack, my point of view is these three components. Number one, the correct model depends on your organization's current structure, culture, and operating environment. But secondly, there's something new. We're all facing a new and transformative future of exponentially accelerating change. So going back to last week, if we agree that linear change is over and exponential change is the future, that tells me that almost every one of our models is obsolete. So what we need to be doing is thinking about the future state as we start to evolve where we're going. And number three, our selection must therefore take into account not only our context today, but also the operating environment that we're going to be in tomorrow. And fundamentally, my conclusion then, therefore, is we will all need to evolve. So hopefully everybody in the room today is going to get some value out of this conversation and be able to start thinking about an action plan for the renovations we need to make, even if we have a current model, to get us to where we need to go in the future. So with that, let's start to look at the different models. So we can think of the frameworks as a continuum. Over on the left side, we have the highly centralized model. These are your organizations that have a very common structure, a command and control structure, a common set of frameworks about how we do change here, processes to actually drive change through the organization from the highest level. Probably not as much on the periphery in terms of empowerment to do your own thing, right? So we're going to look at organizations that largely have more of a command style structure in the centralized model. And we'll talk about the benefits and trade-offs of that in a second. On the other side, we see the highly distributed model. There might not even be a central core. We might actually delegate to the business units different ways of working that allow them to adopt their own methods for change and transformation, manage their own initiatives, do it in their own way. This is oftentimes what happens when we've got organizations built up of lots of different business units with their own sort of cultures and identities. Somewhere then in the middle is our hybrid model, some balancing act between having common core, whether that's a core change approach or strategy activation approach, a common culture and way of working, a common set of metrics that everyone's accountable to, and tailoring on the periphery. Think of it as the 80-20 rule. How do we build some commonality here so we can have some of the benefits of central, but how do we also have some ability at the edges and the periphery to tailor what we're doing? No one model is right. It's going to completely depend on where you're sitting. But let's look at some of the trade-offs between these models. So first, let's examine the centralized model. In the centralized model, we've got a transformation office that sits in the corporate center and has end-to-end ownership of the governance, the planning, and the execution of major enterprise-wide transformations. It's going to act also as that hub of expertise and ways of working. So there's most likely a common strategy activation methodology here, a common PMO, a common set of tools. Maybe we're all aligned around the same change methodology. The core concept of this is that you've got strong enterprise control and tops-down governance. So some examples that we can look at, Walmart's a famous one, centralized control from Bentonville leads to common systems and processes across the entire organization. And when we make a change in one, we are going to make a change in all of them. That's actually core to Walmart's business model. Pfizer and Citigroup are also good examples of centralized models. In their cases, both of them being in very regulated environments. So having a centralized model and a tops-down sort of global transformation office allows a higher degree of risk reduction, cost management, and response to regulatory environments. So command and control in that environment is a big reason for wanting that structure. Let's talk for a minute about the trade-offs in the centralized model. So some advantages are we have strategic alignment. We're able to understand what are the key enterprises and the key enterprise-wide strategic priorities that we need to execute and how do we prioritize those, and we can organize that from the top. So we've got good alignment around where we're investing our resources when. We also have good consistency and standardization in this environment. So we're using common sets of tools, common frameworks, probably aligned around a common change methodology. So there's a lingua franca. Everyone speaks the same language. It also gives leaders a high degree of visibility. We can understand at the highest level how our investments are leading to output and action and driving the KPIs that we want to see. And we can look at that at a central command sort of structure. And ultimately, this gives us some scale and efficiency, right? This eliminates a lot of the redundancy because we've got more shared services in the organization. So there's some real benefits to the centralized model. On the risk side, this actually usually ends up resulting in a very slow organization. So very centralized organizations can have a high degree of control over the smaller number of enterprise-wide initiatives they're running, but it does create bureaucracy and bottlenecks to be able to tailor anything on the periphery. Especially in fast-moving environments, this can actually be a detriment. It also leads to a certain distancing from the business that one-size-fits-all thinking will negatively impact. Because we're making central command and control decisions, we maybe don't know what's happening in the field. We're not as close to the decision-making processes. So sometimes this creates blind spots in organizations. Bottom line in the centralized model, it's historically worked really well in regulated industries or large enterprises with strong corporate cultures, but ultimately it can lead to slower decision-making, slower adaptability in changing environments. Let's now look at the other end of the spectrum. So let's look for a second at the distributed model. In the distributed model, ownership is embedded with individual business units, regions, functions, farther away from the center. There might not actually be a central transformation office, or if there is, it provides a very light touch or guidance, but it really delegates a lot of the decision making to the field. And this really favors speed and ownership, adaptability, but it does have some challenges to it. We'll talk about those in a second, but some examples to kind of frame this for you. Berkshire Hathaway is a famous one. Berkshire Hathaway, as a conglomerate, has a number of independent autonomous business units within its umbrella, and each of them is given an incredible amount of autonomy to manage their own business. That includes their ways of change management, their ways of managing processes, their ways of implementing new initiatives. Likewise, in technology environments like Alphabet, Google, or in organizations that have sector-based or regional-based models like Johnson & Johnson, this is also a favored model because it does delegate decision-making to those sectors or business units based on their unique circumstances, which might be very different than other units in the business. So having a one-size-fits-all approach for these organizations is often a great cost. The trade-offs in the distributed model, well, the advantages are you do have local accountability and ownership. So people at the edges are empowered to make the right decisions that are tailored to the unique needs of their particular business unit or their particular context. It allows faster decision making as a result because we don't have to go through a central function to make this decision. We have the empowerment to make this decision here. And it allows tailoring. It gives us the ability to say what worked for that unit isn't going to work here. We're going to do it differently. So strength in speed, strength in adaptability, strength in empowerment. The risks are we have a high risk of fragmentation and redundancy. We're probably reinventing the wheel in lots of places that we don't need to. We also are probably creating overlap and conflict because sometimes we might be working at an initiative that might be working against something else in the organization, or worse yet, at a strategic level, at an enterprise level, those inconsistent standards and that redundancy could lead to us working at odds with things that are in the benefit of the greater good. So that fragmentation, that redundancy, that inconsistency can actually be a drag coefficient on the organization if we look at it at the enterprise level. So the bottom line for distributed models is that we're looking at organizations that are often favored by entrepreneurial cultures, those working in highly diverse markets, or business models that have highly diverse businesses within them. But without that strong coordination mechanism in the center, it's very hard to keep the alignment around enterprise-wide change. And it's very hard to create prioritization between enterprise-wide and localized initiatives. So let's turn lastly then to the hybrid model. The hybrid model is going to combine enterprise-wide governance with strategic alignment at a local level. I think of this as kind of the 80-20 model. So you've got a central core, common ways of working, perhaps, common ways of measuring success, common KPIs, but you've got the ability to tailor and localize some of the decision making out on the fringes. So this can be referred to as a hub and spoke model or federated model, but it's seen as a highly resilient approach. Some examples of businesses that are operating in this model: Unilever has a global transformation framework, but they have regional markets and product categories that adapt the execution to the local needs of their business units. So they're speaking a common language around change, and they're measuring and managing in a common way. But at the unit level, they're able to tailor what they do on that common approach to what works best in their market or for their business unit. Nestle follows a very similar model. And then I'm going to highlight Microsoft, a case study that I'll be putting in the white paper around this. This Microsoft used to run a highly centralized model. And under Nadella, about 10 years ago, that model shifted to much more of a federated model with the intention of empowering product groups, but having better central alignment in the organization. So here's an example of a large tech giant that has moved to a hybrid model to get sort of the best of both worlds. The trade-offs, of course, exist. So advantages is that you've got central strategy with local execution. You've got shared capabilities, so you can eliminate some of that redundancy by having a common language around our way of working, our way of managing change. And it does create mutual accountability. So the leaders on the edges are accountable for execution of strategy and change and transformation. But we've got control at the center in terms of what those initiatives should be. So there is a shared accountability there between the central organization and the units on the periphery. The risks, this can create a good amount of governance complexity. So we need to make bigger investments in governance in a hybrid model to balance that centralized oversight with that autonomy that is necessitated by this model. It also has the risk of creating some operational misalignment, like the distributed model. So if you're interpreting those strategic directives differently or prioritizing localized goals over the collective, we could run into trouble here. Lastly, there is I say potentially for a reason, so asterisk for a second, potentially higher coordination overhead. So maintaining those shared tools, playbooks, and communications across functions and geographies can require a pretty significant investment in infrastructure and collaboration platforms. But the reason I highlight potentially is that it is my belief, and with companies I've worked with, it's still less than the hidden cost of the redundancy created in a distributed model. So we have a very clear investment that needs to be made to support this model, but it's not a hidden factory. We can assess it. So it's potentially either more expensive or less expensive, depending on how you manage it. Bottom line, in the hybrid model, this is increasingly preferred because we have the necessity of being able to take enterprise-wide change and manage it through the organization, but allow that local tailoring to happen so that it can be interpreted locally and we can get some sort of a best of both worlds. It does require that we have a very strong infrastructure for shared communication, clear role definition, and a common toolkit to make this work. And that toolkit includes the technology and infrastructure to be able to manage and govern this kind of a model. So let's transition now, having set up the models, to the conversation about which one you should look at. Which ones are the right ones for your organization? There's really no correct answer at any given moment, but there's definitely an answer that serves your needs better than others. And to do this, I want to look at sort of four components or four consideration criteria. The first one is organizational scale, size, and complexity. So a large global organization can often benefit from a hybrid model that balances that enterprise control with local responsiveness. But at the same time, maybe smaller or more centralized organizations may find a centralized model more efficient. So if you're in a mid-sized company and you're starting your capability, you might start with a centralized model because you're probably going to get farther faster in the short term. Culture and operating norms are something else you want to look at. So command and control structures may lean towards more centralized models, but empowered entrepreneurial cultures often might align better with a distributed or a hybrid model because those organizations require more tailoring on the edges. Transformation maturity is a third one I'd look at. So organizations that are new to transformation might actually need the discipline of a centralized model at the start. If you haven't already established common ways of working, it's best to launch it from a centralized model. Whereas if you already have those established, you've got the flexibility to move into a more distributed or hybrid model. And then lastly, and the main topic for today is the pace and nature of change. Industries that are facing fast market-driven change might require that decentralized agility. Those that are undergoing those deliberate changes, if I've made a strategy that says these are the key strategic pillars for next year and we need to pivot in this direction, those are requiring that enterprise-wide change and probably require more control. And that requires more centralized coordination. So you need to also ask yourself, what is the pace and the nature of change? Are we able to make slow, methodical, strategic shifts? Or do we have to make small tactical changes more frequently? That might determine what makes the most sense for your organization. To kind of help us think through this, I've put some thinking together in this table to try to show us what that continuum of decisions may look like. I'm not going to read through this today, but we are going to share these slides out for you. But key takeaway is that, like all consultants who say it depends, you've got to ask, depends on what? And if you can find yourself in this chart and say, which of these criteria fit me today? Where are we on this continuum? It might help be a guide to whether we're in the right model for us today. So use this as a tool, if you will, to go back and look at your own organization, evaluate, what are our requirements around speed and agility? What are our cultural traits? What are the strategic alignment levels that we need to have in our organization? And where are we at today? And where do we need to be in the future? A key takeaway from this is that you might move along this continuum and go back and forth as circumstances change. So as I just mentioned in that last example, if you're going from a organization that's working largely in a decentralized way and then decide you're going to pivot your strategy and shift in new ways that require your entire enterprise to shift into new ways of working, you might actually move back towards a more centralized approach in the short term. Likewise, the opposite can be true. So we want to make sure that we understand that we don't need to pick one box. We need to pick the right box for where we're at today and where we anticipate being tomorrow, and then know that we have the flexibility to evolve the model of our transformation office based on the circumstances around us. I want to now pivot to the future and put it through the future-proofing lens for a second. The future of the transformation office, I think, is going to force the evolution of transformation offices from being, when they do exist, more of a project overseer to more of an enterprise enabler. So back to my first contention, the transformation office of the future is going to be one of the differentiators that will create durable advantage for companies. In the future, our transformation offices not only need to manage change, they need to actually be the architects of agility. So not only supporting a culture and a set of tools around change, but also recognizing that we need to build into our transformation model the flexibility to evolve and shift as circumstances change. I will assert that for large global companies, I believe the hybrid model is likely to be the most effective model for the future that we're entering into. We're entering into a world of perpetual transformation. That's going to require a model that allows us to have both top-down direction as well as bottom-up adaptability. And I'm going to reference one of my favorite information graphics, the change lever, to help illustrate why that is. If we all agree that the process of change looks something like taking a current state and moving to a future state, and if we agree that doing that is we're going to require putting pressure on the organization in terms of resources and investments, strategies, and tactics to move from that current state to that future state, then we also need to keep in mind that the amount of resources and therefore the cost and the time to make those shifts is going to be highly dependent on the fulcrum underneath. That fulcrum is the organization's capacity for change. Do the people in our organization, can they move quickly? Can they go over to that adaptive side? Can they be resilient? If so, the amount of pressure we need to put on that fulcrum to make that move and that transformation is less. But if our organization is more entrenched and more resistant to change than our competitors, we're going to be outrun. So to future-proof our model, we need to be thinking about both what are our ways of working around change and how do we shift our organization to be more resilient. So a couple things in support of this, if we believe that not only are we seeing faster pace of change, but what are some other factors that might support this conclusion? Well, first off, let's look at increased complexity. So we know that global organizations are going to need both alignment and local responsiveness to respond to the increased complexity that's going to come with a faster pace of change. The pace of change itself is a significant driver. So that faster disruption is forcing companies to decentralize their execution, but have some strategic oversight. We know we need to get the entire organization to that place faster. So it's going to require enterprise focus. We are benefited from the drivers of tooling and tech advancements. So with new technologies around digital dashboards, new capabilities in AI, and collaboration platforms that allow us to collaborate across great distances asynchronously, we now have a better shot at making hybrid governance more feasible at scale. So that's definitely a wind of change in support of building this kind of a model. And then we also can look to the failed transformations out there. There's lots of lessons about other companies that have learned that overly centralized or overly distributed models on either extreme lack the adaptability that are required to actually face the future that we're going into. So if we look at these four factors combined with the exponential shift in change, I think future proofing is the main conversation we need to have today. So my key takeaway is in a time of accelerating change, hybrid is not a compromise. It's a competitive advantage when built intentionally. If we do this right, we can build an organization that does take the best of both worlds and gives us the ability to make enterprise-wide changes where needed while allowing the flexibility in the periphery to adapt to the minute things that are happening every single day in our context. And the skeptics in you in this room are going to say, well, every time I've heard best of both worlds, I cringe because, when can we achieve that? The reality is best of both worlds can happen if it's done right. So I want to lastly today contrast what good looks like versus what bad looks like in terms of standing this kind of a model up. If poorly implemented, a hybrid transformation office could become a folly of failure. If we've got a lack of role clarity in our model, we're going to end up turning hybrid into a turf war between corporate and business units. And it's going to result in slow execution, confusion, and strategic drift. If we over-engineer the model, we're going to create too many layers, we're going to have too much reporting, we're going to have too many shared services, and this could actually lead to more bureaucracy, not agility. We also have to be concerned about misaligned culture, because if we haven't brought leaders in to that shared accountability and mutual trust, we could actually devolve back to siloed behaviors. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on that culture component, not only to have a shared culture and ways of working, but to have leadership alignment about what, why, and how we're doing it. And then lastly, a big risk to this model is underinvesting in that enablement. So we talked about one of the risks of a hybrid model is that it does require a greater degree of governance. So we need to be making investments in the technologies, the shared systems, the tools, the training, the talent to make the hybrid model work. So this isn't a stand it up in the corner kind of experience. This has to be an enterprise-wide commitment to not only the people, but also the resources to make this happen. On the flip side, in the face of accelerating change, the hybrid transformation office model can be a fortress of durable advantage. If we build this correctly, we can end up with a very, very competitive organization relative to our peers. We know that we'll have better strategic alignment and adaptability at scale. So where speed of adaptation is the competitive edge, hybrid gives you both the responsiveness and the coherence to get things done faster. We're going to have more institutionalized learning and innovation so we can capture that local experimentation and scale it successfully across the organization. We can allow some of that tailoring out in the fringes to be transferred back to the central body as best practices. We can balance the power dynamics in the organization so the governance model can distribute authority while holding the people that are actually executing the change accountable so that we have a common and balanced level of accountability in the organization. And with the benefits of technologies that now exist, we have the advantage of leveraging digital infrastructure to equip and enable human flexibility. So we want to let humans do what they do best, be creative, be innovative, and lean on technologies to support the governance model that allows us to measure, manage, track, and support those major change initiatives. If we do all of that, we've also hopefully built a future-ready framework for flexibility. So this transformation office is not static. It's something that's constantly evolving, and we want to build that into the idea of our transformation office. Be ready for change every single day because change is always on. So in closure, the key takeaways for today. I believe that a well-designed hybrid transformation office approach is the durable advantage of the future. In an environment of perpetual transformation, only a model that supports both top-down direction and bottom-up adaptability can actually successfully scale. So we need to, in the face of this change, start to understand how do we capture those core capabilities, that capacity, and that agility in our model. It's going to require a balance of both of those things. So we're going to need a common core of standardized change tools, frameworks, methodologies. We all need to be speaking the same language. We need to be able to draw upon the same library, and we need to have a central structure to help us prioritize, evaluate, and course correct our actions. That's the transformation office's job to hold that capability. But we also need to focus on building the organizational culture of agility. So this is one of the clear reasons why this has to be an enterprise-wide investment. We have to have a culture that matches that capability. That agility needs to match so that that fulcrum on that change lever is all the way over on the left side so that it takes less resource and less investment to make the changes that we need to see in our organization. So it's going to require a two-part investment. And lastly, the most resilient organizations are not going to choose the right model. They're going to choose the model that works correctly for where they're at today and where they're going in the future and be ready to evolve it constantly. So we need to make sure that change is not only constant outside our walls, but we have that capability built in-house as well, because the transformation office itself is going to have to evolve as circumstances change. So where do we go from here? First, I encourage you to sit down with your team and assess your current transformation capability through those three lenses. Look at the frameworks that are out there, look at the features and the trade-offs with each of them, and then start thinking about and evaluating where are we at today and what's the right fit that we should have going forward. It might be that you're in the right circumstance already and you just need to be thinking about where you're going next. It might be that you're looking at your current circumstances and saying, we need to overhaul this. Or it might be, I have to build this from scratch. Under any one of those three circumstances, there's an evolution to be had in your transformation capabilities. So then your next step is start a conversation internally about how you evolve and future-proof your transformation office. If you've already got a transformation office, you're going to focus on that future-proof part. Where is the world headed? Where are we headed? And what are we going to need in the future to be able to enable that capacity? If you don't have one, take this as a blueprint and start thinking about what you want and what you need for an organization. And then lastly, I'd love to have you join the rest of the series because particularly if you're in that last category, we're going to be laying out a blueprint in the coming weeks for how you stand up a transformation office from scratch, or you can use it as a checklist to figure out what you need to do next. My closing thought is that transformation is no longer episodic, it's continuous and it's accelerating. So you need to build a capability and a culture for transformation in order to build durable competitive advantage. Pound the pulpit, go out and talk to your leaders and keep reciting this. Because if we don't recognize that we need to build this enterprise-wide capability today, our organization is going to be one of the trailers in the future. But we have the possibility today to build a better future for our organization that makes us more competitive and more adaptive. But it comes down to our ability and capacity to make change. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to set up a transformation office. So for those of you that are thinking through this and saying, all right, where do we go next? We're going to lay out an actual roadmap of some of the steps that you would take and the components that you would need to make this happen. Great session for those 42% of you that don't have this today. And for those in the remainder of the group that already have a model, you can use it as a checklist to evaluate where might I have gaps and opportunities and where we're going to go. So I encourage folks, join us in the webinar. I know Julie's dropped into the chat the link to join us next week if you'd like to do that. Also, Julie, I'd ask you to drop in a link for a demo. If folks want to see what technology-enabled transformation looks like, we are going to be doing some demos of the Tigerhall platform. to talk about how we can actually support the transformation office with the technologies to become a force multiplier for oftentimes overtaxed teams. And then lastly, and importantly, I'm always available to folks if you'd like to have a chat about what's going on in your organization or contribute ideas to the series or best practices. Please reach out to me at eric@tigerhall.com. That's Eric with an A. And I'd love to schedule some time for a chat to talk through what you're doing in your organization and either how we can help or how some of your ideas might inspire ideas that I can share with others. So thank you for that. I think we've got just a few minutes for a couple of questions. So, Julie, why don't we take two or three questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, so we do have a couple of different questions. So I'll go in chronological order. So, how would you differentiate between change and transformation? Is there a difference at all? If so, what would it be? And how do you basically deal with that in different ways?
Yeah, it's a very common question. I ask myself this every day. I think my pat answer is that transformation is big C change. So we have a lot of there's a spectrum of changes in the world, right? And there's some changes that are maybe tactical changes at a department level or business unit level, things that we have to shift, maybe a minor process shift, maybe a large technology shift, but that doesn't hit the entire enterprise. It hits maybe a business unit. That sort of small C change is our daily work. On the other side, big C change is the stuff that is truly transformative. It's the stuff that really is going to make a transformative impact to the impact your organization makes in the world. So I think of transformation as those largest enterprise-wide shifts that are going to actually define the organization and its future. They typically look like strategic shifts in the organization. And this is a big reason why I'm arguing that as we go forward, if you don't already have a transformation capability in the organization, you're going to want one because we're going to need to make those shifts a lot faster. We used to lean on a series of cumulative changes to get where we're going. And in the future, we're not going to have the time to do that. We're going to have to make big strategic moves much more quickly. And this is where transformation steps in, and we have to have a central coordinating capability for that. Thanks for that question.
So I have two people who are wondering what difference you see between a transformation office and a change management office or an enterprise change management office or a PMO. So where's the distinction between all those different types of offices?
Love that question. It's my argument would be it's cumulative. A transformation office has to contain all of those pieces and parts. So right now, what I see most commonly in organizations is that we stand up silos. There's a change management team over here who basically are the keepers of the way of change and are going out as enablers and supporters in the organization. Maybe there's a PM over here who's managing the Gantt chart of this is what we need to do by when with what resources, and we need to keep the project on time and on budget. There's maybe a learning and development team over here that's thinking, well, what are the capabilities and skills we need to build in our organization? And how do I track those? And then there's hopefully some sort of a unifying function that's keeping those folks aligned, but oftentimes there isn't. The transformation office serves that role of building that connective tissue. The transformation office has to contain all of those things and more. So the transformation office has to do a couple of things. It needs to, as we said, it needs to align, it needs to orchestrate, and it needs to accelerate. And it's going to do that by building connective tissue between those organizations and the C-suite to make sure that we're aligned with major strategic priorities and we've got access to the checkbook to fund and invest in doing that. So there's a conversation now in the transformation office between the CFO, the chief strategy officer, the CEO, the entire C-suite, and the business that is basically enabled and coordinated and supported by a transformation office that unifies all of those functions. That's my dream. Now, I know and recognize that we haven't built that everywhere yet, but fundamentally, I think that's what we're trying to describe with this series is a very coordinated but light capability to do that if it doesn't exist today.
So we have a question about what advice do you have for those of us who have an ad hoc model? How do we convince an enterprise that needs transformation to go ahead and go a bit more centralized? And somebody else was asking, like, how do you show the metrics or the cost of not implementing this and not becoming more centralized?
Yeah, I think this is about business case building to some degree. And I encourage folks, and maybe Julie, we can send this out. We've actually got a webinar on building a business case for change that I think could answer some of these questions. But the key idea here is we need to start to learn to speak CFO. We need to be able to translate the cost of not doing this into real costs. So if we can identify, for example, where our competitors are moving faster than us and diagnose that there are reasons that we can shift and change to get caught up or ahead of them, we can start to enumerate that. We can enumerate the cost of not doing an enterprise-wide change and building a capability in terms of the time it would take if we do it incrementally. There's lots of different approaches to how we do it, but at the end of the day, I think the answer is for your circumstance, let's go find the business case. What is the case either for not doing something, or what's the case for doing something because it is such a high ROI that we can go in and have a compelling conversation with the C-suite to say, we can't afford not to shift to this way of working. Uh, Love to talk to people about that conversation any day. So if anyone wants to follow up with me individually and talk about your particular business case, I'm happy to do it because I think this is one of the most important bridges that we need to bridge for those of us that are in the change making space is bringing that conversation up to the right elevation in the organization with data to make our business case.
All right. We have maybe one last question.
Okay.
From your experience, which of these models would work best for government organizations?
Oh, that's a tough one. I Well, and the reason I say that is there's such a spectrum of different government organizations. I've worked in highly centralized government units that are very compartmentalized from their other peers. I've also worked in organizations that are in the public service and very open and transparent. So the answer there is going to be a function of where you sit. However, I would still argue and defend that the hybrid model is critical. The reason for it is that in government, typically the government's priorities are very clear. So government, by definition, is going to have a platform of planks of these are the initiatives that we're prioritizing, these are our strategies that we're employing, and we want the organization to orchestrate the delivery of that. So you've already got the condition where you've got some clarity around the central requirements of the government that we need to align with. That gives us the ability to have that coordinating function around central prioritization. But then in each of those business units, based on, we'll call them business units, whatever government entity you're in, you might have a specific mission in delivery of that. So your specific mission has to be tailored. How you act on that strategy has got to be tailored based on your mission. So it does require that tops down coordination with that local adaptation. And that really speaks to the idea of a hybrid model in this environment. Love that question. Thank you so much. I am really glad to have this conversation. I hope to see folks next week as we talk about the model further, exploring how to actually stand this up. And these questions are getting me excited about having some conversations with folks. So again, I do encourage you, reach out anytime if you'd like to chat about these topics, share your personal experience. I love to be able to hear from folks and exchange these kind of conversations and ideas because we're all figuring out where the future is headed. And nobody's got hard data, but we can take good guesses. So let's do that together. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.